The first child born in the new year in Essex County made her appearance at 4:07 a.m. on January 1st, 2020 at the Met campus of Windsor Regional Hospital. Her name is Aria. She weighed in at 7 pounds 3 ounces. Her family's from Leamington, and according to the Windsor Star, her parents were very happy to meet her. Mom said that her water broke exactly at midnight. And her mom also thinks that little Aria looks a lot like her father. You can look all that up. There's a story about it on the Windsor Star website, and there's photos of mom and baby, and there's a little video. It's all pretty cool. This little baby is already famous. Just a few days old. Happens every year. They look for the New Year's baby. But this year it's a little more special because it's the first baby of a new decade. So when this little girl is older, she'll be able to read newspaper articles and look at videos online documenting her birth and connecting the story of her birth to stories of other things going on in the world on that day at that time. In the busyness of our world, most births don't make the newspaper. Well, you can buy an ad, right? You can buy a birth announcement, but otherwise, babies are born all the time. Without fanfare, it just kind of slips by. Not really big news on most days. And that was even more true in the ancient world, the world Jesus was born into. Well, they didn't really have newspapers. They didn't have the internet for sure. And a lot of babies were born in homes, apparently in stables, and there'd be no records kept. But it would only be when they grew up and began to make a mark in the world that people might say, so where were they born? Anything going on when they were born? Was that a special deal? Because back then, a lot of public figures, all the Roman Caesars, the kings of Rome, there would be a special story about how they were born. And actually, it was pretty common for the Roman kings to claim virgin birth, to claim that they were actually a child of the gods. And there'd be a complicated, interesting birth story attached to them. It would be part of the legend of this king who would be worshipped kind of like a god. But most people didn't have that kind of story attached to them. We've been hearing about Jesus and the birth story our whole lives. It makes sense to us to think that when this baby was born in this stable in Bethlehem, that'd be a big deal. And all the movies and the TV programs and stories we hear about it suggest that. But really, he was just born, came into the world. Some people knew about it, came to see what was going on, but nothing much changed for years and years and years until he began his public ministry. People started to hear about him and hear what he had to say about God's love. But back then, there was no Windsor Star. There were no reporters showing up in Bethlehem to record the moment. Definitely no video cameras. There really was nobody there to write down the details of what happened. We have two stories in the Bible about the circumstances and details of Jesus' birth. One in Matthew's Gospel, one in Luke's Gospel. And if you read them side by side, you probably notice they're not the same. They're different stories. And we won't spend a lot of time on that today, but I've talked about that before, and you can go check it out for yourself. Read the first couple of chapters of Luke, read the first couple of chapters of Matthew, and they tell different kinds of stories. When we have a pageant, we kind of mash the two stories together. So the stuff with the wise guys gets tacked on at the end of the story about the story with the shepherds and the whole usual scene, the manger. Scholars say there are two basic reasons that there's such differences in the stories. First is that the writers, they weren't there. They worked up their stories. They created their stories based on what they'd heard, the traditions in their community, passed down kind of like good recipes, oral tradition, because people didn't read and write. They had to remember what they were told, what was passed down to them. So by the time it reached the writer of Matthew or the writer of Luke, maybe it wasn't quite the way that it had been told the first time. Ever play that telephone game? The game where if I tell one person up here a few words and they whisper it to the next person, the next person, the next person, by the time it gets to the back, will it be exactly the same? Could be very different. And we're like that, right? We tell stories and we get the point across, but we change stuff. So maybe the way Matthew heard it and wrote it down, the way that Luke heard it and wrote it down, they wouldn't be exactly the same. So that's one reason why there's differences. Another reason that scholars talk about is that basically it's not a newspaper. The Bible isn't a history book. Matthew and Luke were writing Gospels, and their job was to get people to listen to the good news. I think Matthew and Luke were both preachers. Do preachers sometimes tell stories that aren't exactly true? I mean, other preachers you've had here. Preacher's job is hopefully to be interesting, encouraging, and persuasive, and to tell stories that connect with the people who are listening and help them connect the truth about God to their own lives. So whether all the details in the story are actually historically accurate is often not the point. The preacher wants to get you to listen and to think about God. That's what we do. So Matthew and Luke were kind of preachers, and they told the story in their own way, telling the parts of the story they thought would be interesting to the crowd they knew. And Matthew and Luke had different audiences. A sermon that I can tell here might not work at a church down the road. And some of the stories that get, or sermons told in churches down the road, might not work so well here. Does that make sense? So this morning Eleanor read to us about the Magi. First part is the part we know from all the pageants. The Magi, the wise men, the three kings, whatever we call them, show up, visit, pay homage to the new baby, and leave the gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. That's the story that we're used to. The second half of the story that we heard doesn't usually make it into the pageants, and that's probably okay. I don't think a Christmas pageant needs to have the part where Herod orders the death of a bunch of little babies. That's not very PG, not very Christmassy in the way we're used to. So this King Herod guy seems to be threatened by the coming of a new king, a new Messiah, and wants to find him, do away with him. It's a horrible story. Scholars have remarked that such a brutal and expensive wielding of power, ordering the troops to go out to find all the babies under the age of 2, male babies, and have them killed, that would have been noticed. That would have been written down, at least in military records or in histories of the Roman Empire. But there's no record, and the Romans kept pretty good records, and we have a lot of them. There's no record of any king in the Roman territory of Palestine with the name of Herod ever ordering such an action. It's just not there. Scholars don't go as far to say it didn't happen because that would upset people and confuse them. But they do suggest that maybe something on a smaller scale happened and the story got bigger over the years in our imaginations. As the story was told to one generation and then the next, that a little story got bigger and bigger and bigger. We tend to take it at face value. We tend to say, well, this is the way it happened, because we've heard it so many times. And because it's not hard to believe that a caretaker king appointed by the Romans to run a country for them that he could be insecure, that he could worry about rivals, that maybe he was corrupt, and maybe he was just insane enough to do something like that. Maybe it's because we're cynical. We believe that kings would do stuff like that. We can believe that people in power would do terrible things. Because Matthew includes this piece about Herod in the story, it also gave him a way to tell the story about Joseph being warned in a dream and taking Mary and the baby safely to Egypt. And that's where the preacher comes in. Because Matthew the preacher, one of his ways of talking about Jesus was to compare him to Moses. He'd say, Jesus was trying to save the people, kind of like Moses was trying to save the people who were in slavery in Egypt. Do you know how the Hebrew people got to Egypt? You got to go home today and watch Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, because that tells the story of Jacob and sons who were living their life in Israel, and there's a famine. And Jacob's son Joseph, who his brothers hadn't been good to, that was a whole other story. Joseph is a bigwig, powerful guy in Egypt. And he brings his brothers and their families to Egypt, and they are guests of the Pharaoh. And they prosper, and they live well, and their families grow and grow and grow to the point where the Egyptians don't know what to do with all these Hebrews living in their country, and they enslave them. And years later, this little guy Moses is born, and he's the one who'll become a leader to lead the Hebrew people out of Egypt, out of slavery, back to their promised land, or to a promised land. Do you also remember the baby Moses story? The whole thing about the evil king of Egypt, the Pharaoh, was worried about how the Hebrews were becoming too numerous, too populous. So what did the Pharaoh order? That all the little male Hebrew babies be what? Be slaughtered. Does that sound like another story we just heard? An evil king killing a bunch of little baby boys? So some people think that Matthew kind of remembered that story. He's saying, Jesus is kind of like Moses. You know that story about Moses, where his life was threatened and he was put in that basket and floated in the bulrushes and was rescued? Well, here's a story about Jesus, his life being threatened and him having to be rescued. Not saying it's not true, but Matthew tells that story to make a point. Luke doesn't tell that story, talking to a different crowd. Scholars think that Matthew was writing for an audience of people who'd grown up Jewish but lived in Syria. They were away from Jerusalem, and scholars also think that Matthew's gospel was written anywhere from 75 to 125, 150 years after the time of Jesus. So a couple of generations have passed since the earthly life of Jesus. Something else that's happened is that the Romans are cracking down on the Jews, and they destroy the temple in Jerusalem. They've had it with Jewish rebellion. So the Romans destroy the temple, trying to gut the faith. So these Jews, culturally raised Jews living in Syria, have to figure out how to follow Jesus, who they never met. They've only heard stories about him. And how to still be a Jew. And can you do both? And what does it mean to be a Jew when the temple's not there anymore? So Matthew tells stories about Jesus, who's like a new Moses, who's going to lead the people out of slavery towards freedom. The people who heard Matthew tell those stories, they would have no difficulty believing that there were evil kings who did terrible things, because they'd heard the stories about the Roman kings destroying their temple. They would have no difficulty believing that soldiers could be ordered to do terrible things because that was their life. They lived under Roman rule. They're trying to figure out how to be faithful, how to follow God, how to be good Jews, and how to be good Jews who follow Jesus. It would make sense to them to hear that from the beginning, even as a baby, Jesus was seen as a threat to people in power. The Magi aren't Jewish. They might have been Zoroastrians. They came from lands far away. They were astrologers, maybe. They lived in the sky and they saw stars doing things and they interpreted them. They had this idea that a new king was going to be born. And they follow the star. They go to see the little baby born, and they leave the gold, frankincense, and myrrh. One of the things we love about that story is it's people who are not Jewish who are already starting to be interested in the Jesus movement. And in the early years of the Christian faith, that story was used to say Jesus came not just for the Jews, but for all people. People who would travel across deserts to learn about him. We also love about the Magi that they didn't fall for Herod. And I get a little sense in there that they're religious leaders who don't fall for powerful people. They're careful. So I was wondering, if we were in the States in church today, how many preachers in American churches would be talking about the Magi this morning? A couple days before Christmas, one of the most famous Christian magazines in the world, do you know about this, Christianity Today? Founded by Billy Graham, most prominent, most respected American evangelical Christian you can ever think of. Christianity Today published an editorial calling for the impeachment of U.S. President Donald Trump. This surprised a lot of American evangelical Christians. It annoyed a lot of them too. Made them really mad because American evangelicals, well actually white American evangelicals in the U.S. overwhelmingly supported the presidency of Donald Trump. They voted for him. And they're still supporting him. And whenever all these things that he says, things that he does, whether it's in his personal life, in his business life, or in politics, they don't seem to care about things he's been found to have done. Well, the one that really got me was Donald Trump and his family are no longer allowed to run charities in the state of New York because they ran a charity that collected money for kids who have cancer. And they took $2 million of that money and they put it into Trump's election campaign. So he's not allowed to run charities in New York anymore. But there's a lot of American Christians who say, that's okay. He's the one God wants to be in charge. And they like him because he supports certain issues that they're big on. As long as he's on their side on a few things, they'll support everything he does, everything he says. So this editorial appears in Christianity Today, warning that when faith leaders line up to give unwavering, uncritical support to a political leader, they run the risk of being identified not just with the good stuff the leader does, but with everything. Maybe Herod was a good king. Maybe the state he was in charge of was well administered, and people were receiving the services they needed, and the roads were getting fixed, and people were being cared for. I don't know. But Herod did some stuff that made him a bad king. And the Magi were right. The Magi were right to not trust him. In the churches I grew up in, more evangelical, did you ever hear this phrase that we're called to love the sinner and hate the sin? What does that mean? You accept the person, right? And you support them and you love them and you try to help them, but you don't pretend that you like everything they're doing. You don't pretend that everything that they're doing is okay. We should absolutely support people. God loves everybody. Don't give up on anybody. But when we see them doing some stuff, we have a responsibility to say, no, that's not okay. You're not okay if that's how you're living. How can we help you? So Christianity today calls out all the American evangelicals and says, aren't we supposed to love the sinner but hate the sin? What a daring thing to do. I'm glad they did it. People of faith, we need to be very careful, very cautious about lining ourselves up too closely with earthly kings. At least that's what the Magi thought. Amen.